In the second half of the 19th century, members of the British political elite began to feel increasingly threatened by the rise of competing great powers. Whilst Germany and Russia presented a military challenge to British imperial supremacy, with Germany especially being very keen to develop its own colonies. Along with the United States, they were also serious economic rivals. It began to be argued, particularly from the 1870s onwards, that perhaps free trade was not in Britain's best interests after all. Perhaps Britain's economic future might ultimately lie in a stronger, more unified empire and a series of privileged arrangements with its colonies. In a more threatening world, empire increasingly came to be seen both as a unit of mutual defence and as a unit of mutual economic development. Up until this point, the empire in general hadn't cost the British Exchequer very much. One of the key rules of the imperial administration had been that the colonies should be, to a large degree, self-sufficing. When a new India office was built in London in the 1860s, for example, it was paid for by Indian, not British taxpayers' money. But if the expense or demands of empire were to rise, would the public at large be willing to go on footing the bill? There were certain strands within both the Liberal and Conservative parties that were fearful of a turn against empire. They were worried there was a growing perception that the burdens now outweighed the benefits. Or perhaps worse, that the benefits of empire were accrued by the privileged classes, whilst the burdens were borne by the rest of society.
There's something called the New Imperialism, which is really an attempt to put empire at the centre of the British political agenda and to make not merely the ruling elites aware of it, because they already are aware of it, but making the working man aware of it. And I think the idea of empire is promoted towards the end of the 19th century with more passion and zeal by people like Chamberlain and Milner and Curzon and a whole host of other people, because they also see it as an alternative to the rapid development and advance of socialism, even communism, egalitarianism. If they can get the British working man hooked on the idea of empire being profitable, provider of jobs, a source of glory, source of self-satisfaction, the hope is that these people will not join trade unions, become Bolsheviks and overthrow the ruling order.
We see in the second half of the 19th century, in the later Victorian and Edwardian period, the growth of a whole array, one might even say army, of propagandist leagues and societies and fringe and ginger groups who either are promoting particular imperial agendas, emigration to the empire, imperial naval supremacy, tariff reform, whatever it may be, or there to promote the empire as a concept and the virtues and values of empire more broadly.
It took all sorts of forms. So speaking tours, lecture tours by prominent colonial politicians or by advocates of imperialism, design of school textbooks, creation of Empire Day, the design and propagation of all sorts of memorabilia, paraphernalia to do with the empire, just a general set of strategies for encouraging a sense of belonging within an empire as opposed to a much more local or national frame of reference.
It was then that those maps of the world with the British possessions coloured in red came into English schoolrooms. They never had been before then. The empire was never colour-coded before about 1880, and it doesn't come into schoolrooms until the 1900s, put there by propaganda organisations like the Navy League and so on, in order to encourage this kind of imperial patriotism.
By the end of the 19th century, the empire was much more likely to be part of the fabric of the average Briton's daily life than it had been in 1850. Whether in terms of one's economic well-being, the food one ate or the clothes one wore, and where they came from, or where people in the armed forces had been sent, where one's friends and family lived, where letters were going to and from. Whether looking at elite levels or more popular culture, there's a huge range of cultural artefacts, either about the empire or with an explicitly pro-imperial message. But it's been pointed out by more sceptical observers, at the time and since, that this was almost never the dominant theme in any genre of advertising, music, literature, children's comics, or even early cinema. But does this greater imperial cultural presence point to a deeper commitment to and belief in empire amongst the population at large? Had the British become an imperial people?
What we know about imperial propaganda, notwithstanding the fact that it's been very well and very widely studied over the last 20 years, is how much of it there was, how varied the forms that it took, how energetic and active people were in peddling and promoting it. What is still much harder for us to establish is precisely what effects that it actually had.
We know, and it's relatively easy to know, a lot about the production of such images, of what was put out, whether it's in children's comics or in popular novels or in the music hall or on biscuit tin lids. We know far less, and we can, in the very nature of things, know far less about how it was received, how it was consumed. People bought the biscuit tins, they ate the biscuits. The people who are designing the biscuit tin lids might want to propagandise for empire. But how can we know who and how the pictures of redcoats or faithful Indian servants on those tin lids were looked at? Did they influence anyone politically? Extraordinarily hard to say.
The efforts of imperialists to educate and inform testified not to their confidence in the imperialism of the masses, but to their fears of indifference or even downright hostility. One must unfortunately explain to these damned fools, wrote a despairing Milner of his audiences in 1906, why we want an empire. If the records of policy making are any guide, mass enthusiasm for empire building, whether spontaneous or manufactured, was fleeting at best.
People get excited about the empire in moments of crisis, whilst in routine times there is comparatively little media coverage, comparatively little artistic and other cultural production that's obviously and directly empire related, apparently comparatively little popular interest. There's really not one British general election across the whole of modern history that's fought, won and lost mainly on imperial questions. And when opinion surveys started to come into play, which is only well into the 20th century, of course we find that most people most of the time are quite staggeringly ignorant about the empire. Doesn't mean they don't care, especially when there's a crisis. But it's a fairly loose, broad, vague kind of caring. Often a sort of extension of a more generalised patriotism, and quite hard, often, analytically or politically, really clearly to distinguish what's distinctively imperial from what's a more generalised patriotism or nationalism, or even what one critic about 100 years ago famously called jingoism, a particularly aggressive and perhaps mindless kind of patriotism.
Consent is crucial. Consent is different, I think, from somebody necessarily being very knowledgeable about the empire. It might even be different from someone feeling, in the normal run of things, very committed to it. It's certainly different from someone feeling necessarily that they're emotionally attached to empire. What it means is there is enough level of support there, enough acquiescence, if you like, because that's all you need. Anything more is better, is a bonus, for a body of opinion not to develop that is overtly critical of or antagonistic to empire.
So until you actually had the British taxpayer having to pay an awful lot of money for this sort of thing, and as soon as you got conscripted men in the army, which you never had before 1916, then it caused a problem. It caused a problem in particular when Britain was trying to police Iraq around about 1920, or Mesopotamia it was called then, and she was trying to control it with conscripted soldiers who had been called up in order to defend hearth and home in the First World War, and now found they're going to have to defend the bloody empire, and they mutinied. And secondly, by middle-class taxpayers in the House of Commons who formed a new party in order to oppose colonial expenditure. So as long as it didn't cost either lives or money, or involuntary lives, let's say, or money, then it wasn't particularly troubling, this situation.
By seeking to make people more aware of the empire, propaganda could even have the opposite and undesired effect of increasing hostility towards it. It's perhaps no coincidence that we see a more overt and explicit anti-imperial movement developing at a time when the empire is being promoted more vociferously than ever before.
There's a very strong, I think, explicit anti-imperialist movement that starts off in the very late 1890s, culminates probably in the great sort of original work of anti-imperialism by John Atkinson Hobson called Imperialism: A Study, published in 1902, which became the foundation of what later became the Marxist theory of imperialism, attributing, in other words, imperialism to the overproduction of capital and goods. That certainly in labour and socialist movements in the 1900s, and then in the 1920s and 1930s, becomes really quite powerful. And so powerful, I think, not powerful enough to actually bring the empire to an end, but effective more in getting the imperialists themselves to modify the image they like to give of their imperialism. So that in, again, school textbooks after 1918, you get very little about conquest and battles with natives and everything and so on. And the empire is seen much more as a kind of consensual thing, a kind of big club, a proto-United Nations that everybody originally had asked to join. Please could we join your empire? And loved and played cricket and so on. And that aspect of it, the present Commonwealth ideal was born there and became the dominant thing, I think, because of this anti-imperial criticism from the 1900s onwards, which of course seemed to be justified by this explanation of the First World War as being the result of competing imperialisms.
The tremendous growth of Britain's empire was not, on the whole, underpinned by a corresponding commitment to it amongst the great mass of the population. For much of the century, even when imperial expansion was at its most rapid, the empire often appears only at the margins of public and private life. Somewhat paradoxically, imperial themes in formal education and popular culture were at their most pervasive in the late stages of empire between the world wars, when it's supposedly in terminal decline, rather than at its height in the late 19th century. But even those Britons who had a particular interest in or attachment to empire were not necessarily united by a shared view of it, or moved by motives that we can identify as distinctively imperial. On the one hand, we have an increasingly diverse and pluralistic British society. On the other, a diverse and pluralistic empire. And if you put the two together, the almost inevitable consequence is that British society is going to engage with and respond to empire in many different ways. The empire survived for so long, not because all those caught up in it bought into a shared perspective or set of values, a common imperial British identity, but because different people at different times could see in the empire a space to realise their own goals and ideals, for themselves or their country, perhaps for mankind, and these could all to some extent be satisfied.